The cold did not bother Nora Adeyemi. It never had. She had spent 15 years inside the drilling tunnels of northern Canada, where the rock pressed in from every side and the temperature dropped low enough to turn exhaled breath into fog before it left her lips. She had learned to work in that cold. She had learned to love it, even. Cold meant the ground was stable. Cold meant you were still alive to feel it. The docking bay of Crest Station was not cold. It was loud and wide and smelled like burnt metal and recycled air, and every surface vibrated faintly from the engines buried somewhere deep in the station's body. Nora stepped off the transport with one bag over her shoulder and stood still for a moment. She let the space settle around her. She measured the ceiling height, the grip texture of the floor plating, the way the artificial gravity pulled slightly heavier than Earth standard. She filed all of it away and moved on. A man was waiting near the far wall. He was human, older, with a short beard going gray at the edges and the look of someone who had long ago stopped expecting things to be easy. He raised a hand when he saw her. His name was Holt. He had been on Crest Station for 6 years. Long and auto, know every corridor and every unwritten rule. He walked her to her quarters without wasting words, and on the way he told her what she needed to know. The Dravery ran the station. They were large, efficient, and respected results above everything else. They would ignore her until she gave them area sun not to. The Yavari were smaller, six-limbed, and technically brilliant. They would probably study her. The Sulhuri were the ones to watch. They were elegant and proud, and they had very clear opinions about which species deserved to be in the Galactic Cooperative and which ones did not. Humans, in their view, did not. Nora listened to all of it. She did not ask many questions. When they reached her quarters, she thanked him and set her bag down and looked at the narrow bunk and the single window that showed nothing but the black field of space and the faint glitter of the asteroid belt below. She slept well that night. She always did. The next morning, she attended her first full-team briefing in the main operations hall. The room was built for species larger than humans, and the seats were too wide and too tall, so she sat at the edge of one and kept her feet flat on the floor and her back straight. Around her were Dravhari engineers and 2 Yavari technicians and a handful of others she did not yet know the names of. At the far end of the room stood a Sulhuri in a pale gray robe. He was taloned, thin-boned, and he held himself the way certain people hold themselves when they want you to know they are important. His name, she would learn, was Ambassador Drev. He was a cooperative observer, assigned to Crest Station to assist the performance of a new multi-species integration program. He saw Nora when she walked in. She saw him see her. He leaned slightly toward the aide beside him and said something in a low voice. The aide made a small sound that was clearly a laugh. A Dravery engineer nearby heard it and glanced over, then looked away. Nora found her seat and wrote down her assignment. She was placed in lower deck heavy operations, pressure line maintenance, drilling arm calibration, manual hull work in the sections too cramped for the larger species. It was the kind of work that other engineers avoided when they could. Nora had done harder things in worse conditions before she was 25. She spent the rest of that day in the lower corridors with a pressure gauge and a seal kit, moving through the maintenance checks that had been assigned to her. The corridor was narrow and poorly lit, and the heat from the station's reactor systems radiated through the walls. She worked without stopping. By the time her shift ended, she had covered more ground than the schedule had allowed for. On her way back, she passed a Yavari technician crouched near a junction box. He was small even for his species, with 4 of his 6 limbs occupied with a scanning device. He looked up when she passed. Then he looked at his scanner. Then he looked at her again. She did not know his name yet. She would learn it was Till. She nodded at him and kept walking. That evening, Holt stopped by her quarters with 2 cups of something hot and handed one to her without asking if she wanted it. She took it. They stood near the window and looked out at the asteroid field, which turned slowly in the dark below them like something breathing. He asked how the first day had gone. She told him it had gone fine. He scared if she had met Drev yet. She said she had seen him. Holt made a sound that was not quite a sigh and said that Drev had been on the station for 3 months and in that time had filed 2 formal objections to the human intake program. He said it like a warning. Nora looked out at the asteroids. She told Holt that people who underestimated her had always been useful. He looked at her for a moment. Then he laughed. It was a real laugh, not Applite one, and it sounded like it had not come out in a while. They finished their drinks. She went to sleep. 2 levels below them, deep inside the station's structural frame, something shifted. It was small, almost nothing. A hairline of pressure along a pylon joint that no sensor had been calibrated to find. It had been there for a long time. It was very patient. By the end of her second week, Nora had developed a reputation on the lower decks. Nobody said anything about it directly. Nobody needed to. The other engineers simply stopped being surprised when her work was done ahead off schedule and started being quietly irritated instead. The Dravery did not compliment easily. Their idea of acknowledgement was toe-stop explaining things you had already proven you understood. Foreman Breck, the head of heavy operations, had stopped talking to Nora like she was new. That he still did not talk to her much at all, but the tone had changed. She noticed. She did not mention it. Till, on the other hand, talked constantly. He had started joining her during the meal period 3 days after her arrival, sitting across from her with his food tray and a list of questions she had clearly been collecting all day. He asked them in rapid order, with the focused energy of someone working through a research problem. How long could she hold her breath? What happened to her perception when she had not slept? Could she feel changes in air pressure without instruments? Was it true that humans could continue functioning under pain levels that would cause other species to lose consciousness? Nora answered each question honestly and without drama. Yes, she could hold her breath for nearly 4 minutes with preparation. Sleep deprivation slowed her thinking after about 40 hours. She had learned to read pressure changes through the feeling in her ears and the base of her skull. And yes, she had kept working through injuries that had put other people down, though she had not always been smart about it. Till recorded everything with great seriousness. He told her that human physiology was profoundly underrepresented in cooperative biological studies and that her responses were scientifically significant. She told him she was glad to be useful. He missed the dry humor entirely and said that she was, in fact, very useful and that he intended to write a full analysis. She found she did not mind his company. Ambassador Drev visited the lower decks on a formal tour near the end of the second week. He came with his aide and a Dravery escort, and he walked through the maintenance corridors with the careful expression of someone who did not want to touch anything. He observed the drilling arm calibration work, the pressure seal replacements, the manual systems that kept the oldest parts of the station functional. When he reached the section where Nora was working, he stopped. She was inside a narrow access port with her upper body, her hands around a pressure coupling that a mechanical arm could not reach because the angle was too tight. She had been at it for 20 minutes. The coupling required a specific sustained torque, the kind of force you could not rush without cracking the fitting. She applied it slowly and evenly, the way she had Donnie on the rigs when the equipment failed and the only remaining tool was her own body. Drev watched for a moment. Then he said to his aide, in a voice just loud enough to carry, that this was precisely the type of labor humans were naturally suited for. Physical, repetitive, low complexity. He said it the way you might describe a function of a machine, without malice and without the slightest awareness that it was insulting because in his view, it was simply accurate. The aide agreed. They moved on. Nora finished the coupling. She climbed out of the access port and checked her work with a pressure gauge and wrote the result in her log. Clean. With intolerance. She moved to the next section. That evening, Till found her before she reached the mess hall and pulled up a data display on his scanner with obvious excitement. He had been reviewing the lower deck efficiency reports. By every metric the Yavari used said to measure engineering output, Nora was performing at a level that exceeded 3 of the other heavy ops engineers on the team. He wanted her to know that he seemed to think she would be surprised. She looked at the numbers. She told him that was good. He waited for more. She told him to send her the report so she could add it to her file. He sent it. She ate her dinner. Later, Holt found her in the corridor near the observation window on the station's east side. She was standing with one hand flat against the wall, not leaning, just touching it. He asked what she was doing. She told him she had felt something earlier. A vibration. low and slow, 3 seconds at most, deep in the wall rather than on the surface. He asked what she thought it was. She said she did not know yet. In the drilling tunnels, a vibration like that meant one of two things. Either something large had shifted in the rock far below, or something was building pressure along a fault line that nobody had found yet. She said that most of the time it was the first one. The problem was the second one. Holt looked at the wall. He said the station ran diagnostics every 72 hours and nothing had come back flagged in months. Nora nodded. She took her hand off the wall and told him she was probably wrong. She went to her bunk and laid down in the dark and listened to the station's usual sounds and waited to see if the vibration came back. It did not. Not that night. She filed a short, informal observation note in the morning anyway, describing what she had felt and the time she had felt it. She sent it to Foreman Breck's report inbox. She did not expect much from it. She filed it because not filling it would have felt like leaving something on the ground that should have been picked up. 3 days later, at 0300 station time, she felt it again. The second vibration lasted 7 seconds. Nora counted each one with her hand pressed flat against the wall of her quarters and her eyes open in the dark. 7 was worse than 3. Not because 7 seconds was catastrophic in its own, but because 3 seconds followed by 7 seconds meant the interval was not random. It had a pattern. Patterns meant something was building. She got up, dressed, and went to find Till. He was in the technical bay, which was where he usually was when he was not sleeping or eating. He looked up when she came in and correctly read her expression as something other than a casual visit. She told him what she had felt and when. She told him about the first vibration and the note she had filed. She told him what these kinds of patterns had meant on the deep shaft rigs, where the rock was always talking to you if you knew how to listen. Pressure did not vanish. It moved. It found new paths. And when it could not find a path, it found a crack instead. Till was quiet for a moment. Then he sat down at a station and started pulling data. He brought up the geological stress readings for the asteroid field below and overlaid them against the structural load data for the station's lower pylons. He ran it back 30 days. Then he ran it back 60. There was a pattern. It was small enough that the station's automated systems had never flagged it. The readings sat inside the safe range every time they were sampled. But a direction of the pressure was not random, and it was not static. It was accumulating, very slowly, very steadily, toward the base of the lower stabilizer column on the station's south-facing side. Till looked at the data for a long time without saying anything. Then he said they needed to bring this to Director Ossie. Ossie received them in his office the following morning. He was a large man, even by Dravery standards, and his office was built to match. He listened to everything they said without interrupting. He looked at the data Tiln had pulled. He turned to his senior engineering lead, a Dravery named Foreman Breck, and asked for his assessment. Breck studied the numbers. He said the readings were within established safety margins at every point. He said the station AI ran continuous structural monitoring and had not raised a concern. He said that the variation in the stress data was consistent with normal gravitational flux from the asteroid field. He said all of this carefully and without dismissing Nora directly. Ossie thanked them. He said he would have the AI run an extended diagnostic in the stabilizer column, and that he would review the results personally. He told them to return to their posts. They returned to their posts. Ambassador Drev was in the operations hall that afternoon for a scheduled debrief with the station's department heads. At some point during the meeting, someone mentioned that 2 junior engineers had brought a structural concern to the director's attention that morning. It was mentioned briefly and without much detail. Drev asked who the engineers were. When he was told one of them was human, he made a short sound and said it was notable that a human and a junior Yavari had appointed themselves the station's safety inspectors when an entire Dravery engineering team had found nothing wrong. He said it with a slight smile. There was laughter from a few people in the room. Nora was not in the room. Till was, because he had been asked to present a technical summary on a separate matter. He did not respond to the laughter. He finished his summary, logged off his station, and went to find Nora. He told her what had been said. He seemed unsure how she would take it. She told him to file a formal report through the cooperative's official safety channels. not just the internal station system. She told him to put both their names on it and to include all the data, every reading, every date, every note she had filed since the first vibration. She told him to write it in cooperative standard format, so it could not be easily set aside. He filed it that evening. A confirmation came back within the hour. The report had been logged, and a formal review was scheduled for the following week. Neither of them said much after that. Till asked if she thought they were wrong. She said she hoped so. There was a long pause. He asked what she thought the chances were that they were right. She said she did not know. She said that in her experience, the earth, or the rock, or whatever solid thing you were standing on, did not give you many warnings before it decided it was done being patient. She went to her bunk. She lay down and stared at the ceiling and listened to the station breathe around her. She thought about the pylon, about the stress fracture that might or might not be forming in its base, about the gravitational pull of the asteroid field below, steady and constant and completely indifferent, about the way certain kinds of failure happen, not with a sudden crack, but with a long and quiet accumulation of pressure until one unremarkable moment when a thing holding it all together simply could not hold anymore. She closed her eyes. At 0300 station time, every alarm on Crest Station went off at once. The sound hit like a physical thing. Red light flooded every corridor. Somewhere far below in the station's structural core, the south stabilized Erpelin had begun to fail, and it was doing so very quickly and very badly, and there was not going to be a week to wait for any review. The command deck was controlled chaos. Every screen showed a different warning. Director Ossie stood at the center of it all and did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He asked questions and people answered them, and a picture came together fast and ugly. The south stabilizer pylon had sheared along its base joint. The failure was inside a pressurized maintenance shaft that ran vertically through Thepelon's core. The shaft existed for exactly this kind of repair situation. The problem was the pressure inside it. The fracture had allowed superheated gas to flood the shaft from the station's lower thermal systems. Temperature and pressure levels had spiked to nearly double their normal readings. Every citrated species on the station had a hard ceiling on what their equipment could handle. That ceiling was well below what the shaft was sitting at. 2 hours. That was the estimate before the pylon failed completely. After it, the station would lose its anchor against the asteroid field's gravitational pull. After that, 6 hours before the tidal forces started pulling the station's frame apart. The Dravery team tried drones first. 3 of them. The first stopped functioning 40 seconds in. The second lasted just over a minute. The third made it to within 15 meters of the fracture point before the pressure crushed its casing and it went dark on the screens. The shaft was too compromised for remote operation. The repair needed hands. Ossie turned to his senior Dravery engineers. They gave him the answer he already knew. Their suits could handle high pressure and heat, but not at these levels. Not for the time the repair would take. He would lose engineers before they reached the fracture. He did not respond to that. He turned back to the screens. Nora was standing near the back of the command deck. She had come up when alarms went off, the same as everyone else. She had been watching the data and doing the math and arriving at the same place the Dravery team had, only from a different direction. She stepped forward and spoke clearly so Ossie could hear her above the noise. She said she could go in. The room got quieter, not silent. The alarms were still running, but the people nearest to her stopped what they were doing. She did not wait for someone to ask her to explain. She told Ossie what the pressure readings inside the shaft meant when converted into the units used in deep shaft mining operations on Earth. She had worked in conditions that, measured the same way, were comparable. She had a Class 4 pressure certification from the Canadian Northern Mining Authority. 15 years off documented operation in environments that most people on this station would not survive an hour in. Her suit rating covered what the shaft was currently reading. It was in her personnel file. She said all of this once, without raising her voice, without asking for anything. Ambassador Drev spoke before Ossie could respond. He said sending a human into the station's most critical structural repair in its history was not a solution. It was a gamble. He said Nora's certifications were from an Earth-based program that the cooperative had no framework for evaluating. He said a risk was irresponsible. He said it firmly and with the full weight Ophi's diplomatic standing behind every word. Several people looked at Aussie. Several looked at Nora. Nobody looked at Drav after the first moment, till pushed past two Dravery engineers to reach the nearest data station. He pulled Nora's complete file. Her full certifications, her conversion-rated pressure scores, her 15-year incident record, which contained 0 uncontrolled failures, and he put all of it on the main display where every person in the room could see it clearly. He did not make a speech. He just stood next to the display and waited. Aussie looked at the numbers for a long time. Then he looked at Nora. He asked her one question. He asked if she understood that if her suit failed inside that shaft, there was no way to retrieve her. She said yes. He said, "Gear up." Nora was already moving. She crossed the corridor to the equipment bay and pulled her gear from the locker. She worked fast and without wasted motion, the way you learn to work when time has a price. Holt was there when she turned around. She did not know how he had gotten there ahead of her. He was holding a thermal buffer sleeve, specific equipment for high-heat pressurized environments, not standard issue on a station like this. It was from his personal kit. He had brought it from Earth 6 years ago. He held it out without saying anything. She took it. She attached it to her suit, sealed her helmet, checked every connection once more, and walked to the shaft entrance. The door was a heavy pressure seal. She input the override code Aussie had transmitted to her. The seal unlocked. The door opened 2 inches, and she felt the heat immediately, even through the suit, even before she was inside. She stepped through. The door sealed behind her. The shaft swallowed the corridor light and gave her only the red emergency strips along the wall and the small white beam of her helmet lamp cutting through air that was thick and already shimmering with heat. Every indicator on her suit climbed fast. She silenced the alarms one by one, as she kept walking. The shaft wanted her to stop. She could feel that clearly. The heat pressed against the suit from all sides, not like a fire but like a weight, something that pushed rather than burned. The pressure was the same. It did not stab or shock. It simply settled onto her from every direction and made each step cost more than the last. She had felt this before. Not exactly this, but close enough. In the northern tunnels, there were sections where the rock breathed heat from deep below and the air sat so heavy in your chest that breathing felt like a deliberate act you had to remember to perform. She had worked in those sections for entire shifts. She knew how to move through a space that did not want her there. You do not fight it. Fighting costs energy you do not have. You accept the weight and you move anyway, one step and then the next, and you do not think about the full distance because the full distance does not matter. The next 3 meters matter. Then the 3 after that. The red glow of the emergency strips gave her just enough light to see the walls on either side. The shaft was roughly 2 meters wide, tight enough that she could touch both sides with her arms extended. The floor was solid beneath her boots, and that was good. She kept her steps deliberate and even. Her suit temperature alarm had been silenced, but the number was still climbing on the edge of her display. She watched it the way you watch a gauge in a machine you're not sure of. Present. Noted. Not acted on yet. Halfway down the shaft, the walls began to show the first signs of the structural stress. The metal had warped slightly inward on the left side, a gentle bow that would have been invisible to someone who was not looking for it. She put her hand on it as she passed. It was not hot to the touch through her glove. It was vibrating, very faintly, the way metal vibrates when something is pulling at it from the far end. She knew what was at the far end. On the command deck, Till was reading her biometrics aloud in a low and steady voice. Heart rate elevated but within working range. Oxygen use high but tracking to projection. Suit pressure holding. Temperature on the outer layer climbing, but the inner layer stable. He read the numbers without commentary. He just kept reading them so that everyone in the room knew where she was and that she was still moving. Director Aussie stood with his arms at his sides and watched the structural stress display. The pylon readings had not gotten worse in the last 8 minutes. They had not gotten better either. They were waiting. Ambassador Drev stood near the far wall. He was not looking at the structural display. He was watching Till's screen, the one with Norse biometrics. He had not said anything since Aussie gave the order. At the bottom of the shaft, Nora found the fracture. It It was worse than the data had suggested, which in her experience was how these things usually went. The base clamp, a heavy ring of reinforced alloy that held the pylon joint in alignment, had cracked along a diagonal line from the upper left to the lower right. The two halves were pulling apart under the load from above. Not fast, maybe a millimeter every few minutes, but they were moving. She could see the gap between them clearly in the beam off her helmet lamp. She assessed it the way she had been trained to assess a failing rig joint. What is moving? Which direction? How fast? What will stop it? The answer was straightforward, the same as it always was when the complicated solution had already failed. She needed to hold the two halves in alignment while the bonding compound she carried in her kit set and cured. The compound needed 19 minutes to reach structural grade. The clamp needed continuous force for all 19 of those minutes, or the halves would drift and the bond would form crooked and fail under load. She put her kit on the floor. She got her hands around the clamp. The metal was hot, even through her gloves. She braced her boots against the base of the shaft wall, found the best angle she could in the tight space, and she pulled the two halves together. She felt them resist. She pulled harder. Slowly, they came into alignment. She held them there. She applied the bonding compound with one hand while keeping pressure with the other. Then she put both hands back on the clamp and held. The suit temperature alarm came back on. She silenced it again. Till's voice floated up from the comm unit. He said the pylon stress readings had just stopped climbing. He said they were holding flat. His voice was calm, but she could hear what was underneath it. She kept holding. The work did not care how she felt. The clamp did not care that her arms were burning or that the heat was pressing the suit harder with every passing minute or that sweat was running into her eyes inside the helmet. The work asked only one thing, that she not let go. So she did not let go. She counted the minutes in her head. She had learned to count time accurately years ago because in the tunnels your instruments sometimes failed in, you needed to know how long you had been inside. She counted without rushing. She did not try to make the numbers come faster. 17, 18, 19. She held for a further 30 seconds. Then she released the clamp and took her hands away and looked at the joint in the beam of her lamp. It held. She checked the bond line with her gauge. Full cure. Clean. The clamp was one solid piece again. She picked up her kit. She turned around. She began walking back up the shaft. She walked back up the shaft the same way she had walked down it. Slowly, point one step at a time. She did not rush. Rushing in a pressurized environment after sustained physical work was how people made mistakes, and she had not come this far to make a mistake on the way out. The heat had not dropped. The pressure had not dropped. The shaft was still the same hostile place it had been when she entered. The only difference was that the vibration she had felt in the walls on the way down was gone. The metal was still. The pylon was holding. She counted her steps on the way back. It was a habit from the tunnels, where the distances were long and the landmarks were few, and keeping count was the only way to know exactly where you were without looking at equipment that might have fogged or failed. She counted. She moved. The red strips along the walls guided her upward. The pressure door appeared in the beam of her lamp. She reached it. She found a release handle and turned it, and the seal broke with a sound she felt more than heard, and cool air came rushing in around the edges, and she stepped through. The corridor on the other side was brighter than she remembered. She unsealed her helmet and unclipped it and held it at her side. The air in the corridor tasted clean. She breathed it in once and stood still for a moment. The corridor was not empty. A small group had gathered near the junction at far end. She had not expected that. She walked toward them. Director Ossie came forward when she reached the junction. He was not a man who moved quickly or lightly, but he crossed the distance between them without hesitation. He stood in front of her and placed his right hand briefly on her left shoulder. It was the Dravery gesture of formal acknowledgement. She had read about it, but never seen it used. Among his people, it was not given carelessly. She nodded once. Foreman Breck was standing behind Ossie. He extended his hand toward her, palm forward, fingers together. The human handshake. He had clearly practiced it because his form was correct. She shook it. He did not say anything. Neither did she. The handshake said everything he intended it to. Till was a few steps behind Breck, vibrating with restrained energy in the way that Yavari did when they were full of things they wanted to say. She could see him counting down from something. He made it about 4 seconds before he asked his first question, whether the thermal readings inside the shaft had felt consistent with her projections or had there been unexpected variation in the gradient near the fracture point. She told him the heat was heavier near the fracture, which she had expected, and that the floor temperature was higher than the wall readings suggested it should be. She told him to add that to his analysis. He immediately pulled out his scanner. She told him she would answer the rest later. He agreed. Then he said, quietly and very directly, that he was glad she was back. She told him she was glad to be back. Holt was leaning against the wall at the edge of the group. He had his arms folded and his expression gave nothing away, but when she looked at him, his shoulders dropped about an inch, which on him was equivalent to someone else falling over with relief. She tilted her head toward him in a small nod. Here turned it. Ambassador Drev was not in the corridor. She asked Holt about it later. When the two of them were sitting in the mesh hall with food, she found she was extremely hungry for. He told her that Drevid left the command deck shortly after Aussie gave the all-clear on the pylon. Nobody had seen him since. Holt said it without any particular satisfaction, that he said it the way you report a fact that is interesting but does not change anything important. 3 days later, Till found her in the lower corridor and told her, with the careful tone of someone sharing information they think might matter, that Drev's official observer report to the Cooperative Council had been updated. He had seen it because it contained references to engineering data he had been asked to verify. The section that had previously argued against expanding the human intake program had been revised. The language about human suitability in industrial postings had been removed entirely. No announcement was made. No explanation was given for the change. It was simply different now. Nora finished the pressure check she was working on and wrote the result in her log. Clean. Within tolerance. She moved to the next section. The station incident report was filed 4 days after the event by Director Rossi's office. It was the standard format used for all structural events on cooperative stations. It described the failure, the conditions, the attempted solutions, and the outcome. It was dry and precise the way all official records were. The responder field contained one entry. En Adiyimi, Human, Heavy Operations Division. Crest Station, status, mission complete. Incident closed. Somewhere between the pressure data and the structural analysis, in the plain and official language of a station log that nobody outside the Cooperative's records office would ever read closely, was the only answer she had ever needed to give. She had not said it with words. She had said it with 19 minutes off holding something together that everything in that shaft was trying to pull apart. She had said it with her hands and her training and the 15 years of hard and quiet work that had made her exactly the person she was when the station needed someone to be that person. It had always been enough. She had always known that. Now the record knew it too.